Here's something that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Every crystal you've bought, every meditation app you've opened, every sage bundle you've burned. If you haven't done this one thing Jung identified, you haven't raised your vibration at all. You've just made the cage prettier. And I know that's a hard thing to hear, because most of us have spent real time, real money, real emotional energy on the idea that if we just do enough spiritual work, we'll finally feel free. We'll finally feel like we're living at a different level. But Carl Jung, one of the most rigorous psychological minds who ever lived, spent decades studying exactly the kind of people who believed they were spiritually ascending. And what he found wasn't inspiring. It was devastating. He found that most of them weren't rising, they were hiding, using the language of elevation to avoid the work of it. Today, we're going to talk about the 5 specific things Jung said you must completely release to genuinely transform, not manage, not reduce, release entirely. And I'll warn you now, by the time we get to number 5, most people realize this video is actually about them, in a way they didn't expect. If this kind of deep psychological content is what you're looking for, hit subscribe right now. We go here every week. Real frameworks, no fluff. Let's get into it. Jung had a concept he called individuation. The process of becoming fully, authentically yourself. Not the self your parents needed you to be, not the self your culture approved of. Your actual self, and his central insight, the one that makes the whole framework click, is this. You don't raise your consciousness by adding things. You raise it by removing what's blocking it. Think about that for a second. We live in a world that's always trying to sell us the next addition, the next practice, the next ritual, the next retreat, and there's nothing wrong with any of those things. But Jung would say, if you haven't done the subtractive work first, all you're doing is decorating a wound. Your natural state, what people mean when they talk about high vibration, is already inside you. It's not something you have to build from scratch. It's something that emerges when you stop piling psychological armor on top of it. He used to ask his patients a question that most found deeply unsettling. He'd look at them, these people who came to him desperate for transformation, and ask, what are you willing to give up to get there? Not what practices they'd add, what they'd give up. Because here's the brutal truth Jung kept running into. Everyone wants to feel elevated. Almost nobody wants to pay the actual price of it. The price isn't more effort. It's more honesty. It's the psychological death of patterns you've built your entire identity around. And most people, when they really understand what that means, quietly choose to stay where they are. They keep meditating. They keep reading the books. They keep talking about consciousness. And nothing fundamentally changes. So, 5 things. Let's go. Give up the need to be seen as good. Jung called this the persona, the carefully constructed mask of acceptability you've spent your whole life polishing so that other people will approve of you and won't reject you. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. The more spiritual someone is, often the more elaborate the persona. Think about the amount of energy you spend managing how you appear, making sure people think you're kind, making sure they see you as patient, as giving, as enlightened. You bite down on things you actually feel because spiritual people don't get angry, right? You override your own limits because conscious people are forgiving. You exhaust yourself saying yes when everything in you wants to say no, because that's what good people do. Jung's conclusion was stark. That performance of goodness, it's one of the lowest frequency states a human being can operate from. Not because goodness is bad, but because performing goodness is fear-based, front to back. You're not being good because it flows naturally out of who you are. You're performing good because somewhere deep down, you're terrified of what happens if people see the real version of you and decide it's not enough. That terror, that constant internal monitoring of how you're coming across, keeps you vibrating at the frequency of survival, not sovereignty. The people Jung observed who had genuinely elevated their consciousness. They stopped performing goodness and started being real. And real meant they could be warm and they could be fierce, generous and also firm, compassionate and also completely unwilling to be manipulated. They accessed their full range as a human being instead of locking themselves inside the narrow corridor that society labels good. This terrified the people around them, because someone who's let go of the good persona is genuinely unpredictable. You can't guilt them. You can't shame them into compliance. They've accepted that some people will think they're selfish, or cold, or difficult, and they're okay with that. Here's the psychological reality underneath all of this. For a lot of us, being seen as good was our primary survival strategy as a child. You learned early that being agreeable kept things stable, that performing the right kind of person bought you safety or love or at least kept the peace. And so you built your entire identity around it. Releasing that isn't uncomfortable. It's terrifying, because you're not just changing a behavior, you're dismantling the architecture of your sense of self. Jung said you'll know you've actually moved through this when you can disappoint someone and not collapse, when you can be completely misread by someone and feel no compulsion to correct it, when someone calls you selfish and you can sit quietly with your own truth without needing them to change their mind. That kind of internal solidity, where your sense of who you are doesn't depend on anyone else confirming it. That's what an elevated frequency actually feels like from the inside. Drop in the comments, unmasked, if you've ever exhausted yourself performing goodness for people who never even asked you to. The quiet performance, the silent resentment, the smile that costs you something real. Let me see how many of us are in this together. Give up the belief that you can help everyone. Jung studied what he called the wounded healer archetype, the person who is compulsively, almost magnetically drawn to fixing, saving, and rescuing other people. And his finding was one of the most confronting things in all his work. The compulsive need to help almost never comes from genuine compassion. It comes from an unhealed wound in the helper that's going to land differently for different people. So sit with it. Think about your helping, not the natural moments when someone you love needs support and you want to give it. I'm talking about the compulsive version, the helping you do even when people haven't asked, the advice you give whether it's wanted or not, the solutions you volunteer before someone even finishes describing their problem, the friends you keep around who never seem to get better no matter how much you pour into them. Jung asks, who is that helping, really? Because what he found was that the wounded healer, unconsciously, strategically surrounds themselves with people who will never fully get better. Because if those people healed, the healer would lose their identity, would lose their sense of purpose, would have to finally turn around and face their own unresolved pain, the one they've been too busy to look at because they were always so focused on everyone else's. The helping isn't service, it's avoidance, sophisticated, socially praised, genuinely well-intentioned avoidance, but avoidance, and it vibrates at the frequency of lack, not love. You help because you don't feel valuable without being needed. You save because if everyone's okay, you have to face yourself. People who actually vibrate at high frequencies in Jung's observations, they could offer support when it was genuinely asked for and appropriate, but they weren't driven to fix every suffering person they encountered. They could see someone struggling and trust that the struggle was part of that person's path. They understood that sometimes intervening is the most loving thing you can do, and sometimes it's the most arrogant. The real question you need to ask yourself, and this is the one that stings, is, do I help people because it actually serves them, or because of what it does for me? No right or wrong answer here, just honesty. Here's a genuine question worth sitting with, and I want your real thoughts in the comments. Is there such a thing as helping that's 100% selfless? Or does every act of helping serve the helper in some way too? Real question, no judgment. Tell me what you actually think. Quick pause. If you're finding this useful, subscribe if you haven't already. We do this every week. Jung Psychology, the frameworks that actually shift how you see yourself. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss what's coming next. Give up the need to be understood. This is the quiet one, the one people don't see coming. And Jung thought it might be the most insidious of all. How much energy do you spend trying to make people get you? I'm talking about the conversations where you explain yourself for half an hour, searching for the right framing, the right words, the right angle that will finally make the other person understand why you feel what you feel or did what you did. And when they still don't get it, you feel invisible. So you try again. Different words this time. Maybe these will land. Jung saw this pattern over and over, and what he diagnosed underneath it was a fundamental lack of self-trust. If you need someone else to understand your experience in order for that experience to feel valid, you haven't yet built the internal authority that genuine psychological freedom requires. You're outsourcing your sense of reality to another person's ability to comprehend it. And that is one of the most disempowering places a conscious person can live. High-frequency consciousness, whatever you want to call it, is characterized by this: I know what I know. I feel what I feel. And whether you can understand that or not doesn't change the fact that it's true for me. That's not arrogance. That's self-trust. Most of us operate in the opposite mode. If someone doesn't validate our perception, we start second-guessing our perception. If nobody else sees what we see, we wonder if we're seeing clearly. We need consensus to feel stable, and that need for agreement, for comprehension, for being gotten, keeps us in an endless cycle of performing and explaining ourselves to people who often simply aren't equipped to understand us. Not because they're bad, but because they're not inside your experience. Releasing this means accepting something quietly devastating. Most people won't fully understand you, and that's okay. It's not a problem to solve. Jung warned that letting go of this need would feel like loneliness at first. A lot of the social glue in our relationships is actually built from the constant effort of explaining and being explained to. When you stop doing that, when you stop performing your inner life for an audience, some relationships thin out, some dissolve. But what's left? Relationships where you don't have to explain, where you can just be present, where the other person isn't understanding a performance of you. They're encountering the actual you. You'll know you've moved through this release when someone misunderstands you completely, and you feel settled, curious maybe, but not compelled to fix it. Give up the fantasy of who people could become. Jung called this projection, and it's probably responsible for more prolonged suffering than almost any other psychological mechanism he identified. Here's how it works. You meet someone, a partner, a parent, a friend, and you see their potential, who they could be if they did the work, healed their wounds, chose differently. And instead of relating to the actual person in front of you, you start relating to that future version, the one that doesn't exist yet, the one you're patiently waiting to arrive. You stay in relationships that consistently hurt you because you're convinced this person is about to turn a corner. You give chance after chance to someone who has shown you exactly who they are, because you're relating to who they could become, not who they actually are right now, today. With this behavior, Jung was direct about this. The fantasy isn't about them. It's about you. You're not seeing their potential. You're projecting your own need onto them. Your need for them to be safe. Your need for them to be capable. Your need for them to change so that you don't have to make the hard decision to walk away from someone you love. And that projection operates at a low frequency because it's rooted in denial. You are refusing, very understandably, very humanly, to see what's actually in front of you. The people Jung observed who had genuinely elevated their perception saw people clearly, as they were, not with pessimism, not without compassion, but with clarity. They could hold space for the possibility that someone might change, while also making decisions based on current reality, not potential futures. This one requires grief, real grief, because releasing this fantasy means accepting things that are genuinely painful. The parent who you've been waiting to really see you probably isn't going to. The partner you've been convinced could be extraordinary if they just chose it. They're showing you who they choose to be every day. The friend who keeps crossing lines hasn't been unlucky with their timing. That is who they are. Mourn the fantasy version. Genuinely mourn them. And then look at the real person. Decide with clarity, not bitterness, whether you want to be in relationship with that actual human being. Comment the word clarity. If you've ever stayed in a situation, a relationship, a job, a friendship, way longer than you should have, because you were in love with who that person or thing could have been, not who it was, who it could have been. If that's ever been you, I want to know you're here. Give up the identity of being wounded. This is the hardest one, and I want to handle it carefully, because this is not about denying that real harm happened to you. It did. Your pain is real. Your history is real. What was done to you matters. But Jung made a crucial distinction that most healing frameworks never reach. There's a difference between processing your wounds, which is necessary and vital, and organizing your entire identity around them. And a lot of people, without realizing it, Make the second one their permanent address. You know this pattern, maybe from others. Maybe, and I say this with full compassion, from yourself. The person whose trauma is always the first chapter of every story they tell, whose struggles always trace back to the same root, who connects with others primarily through shared pain, whose choices, relationships, and entire way of moving through the world are filtered through what was done to them rather than what they're choosing now. Jung called this operating from victim consciousness. Not as a judgment, he was precise about this. He used victim as a psychological descriptor, not a moral one. It simply means your orientation is defined by what happened to you, rather than what you're choosing to do from here. And here's the confronting part. This identity comes with real benefits. People are more patient with you. You have a coherent explanation for why things are hard. You belong to communities built on shared pain, and that belonging can feel like love. Giving up the wounded identity means giving all of that up and stepping into the much lonelier, much more demanding position of being responsible for your life, regardless of what happened before. Jung observed that people often resist this final release for one specific reason that's uncomfortable to name. They're more invested in being right about their woundedness than in actually healing. They need the validation. Yes, it was bad. Yes, it wasn't fair. More than they want to step into the open, uncertain territory of what comes after. And so they stay. Not because they can't heal, but because healing would cost them their story. Releasing the wounded identity doesn't erase your history. It means you've grown larger than it. The experiences become part of you, not the headline of you. You'll know you're there when your past stops being the most interesting thing about you. When your trauma history isn't your opening offer in new relationships. When you're more focused on who you're becoming than on explaining who you are because of what happened. That shift from past facing to future facing is one of the most profound things a human being can do. Let that land for a moment before I say anything else. 5 releases, 5 psychological deaths, the need to appear good, the compulsion to fix everyone, the hunger to be understood, the fantasy of who people could be, the identity of being wounded. Jung's observation was this: most people never release any of them. Not because they're weak, not because they're not sincere, but because each release is a real death of something you've built your life around. And humans, all of us, resist death with everything we have, even metaphorical death, even the death of patterns that are quietly destroying us. And so we keep adding more practices, more rituals, more vocabulary, more expensive cushions, and more eloquent ways to describe our inner journey. And we wonder why we still feel stuck. You cannot add your way to a subtraction problem. The math doesn't work. You cannot vibrate higher while clinging to patterns that belong to a lower frequency. Something has to go. What becomes possible when you actually release these 5 things isn't some blissful, floaty, out-of-body experience. It's simpler than that, and more durable. You start operating from authenticity instead of performance, from genuine care instead of compulsive rescuing, from self-trust instead of external validation, from reality instead of fantasy, from wholeness instead of wound, and that, from the inside, feels like standing up straight for the first time, solid, honest, real. Yours, not because anyone confirmed it, not because the right people finally understood, not because your story has been validated by enough people who agree with it, just because it's true. And you know it's true, and that's enough. That's Jung's framework. That's the actual path. Not up inward, not more, less, and it costs you everything you've been clinging to, while giving you everything you actually came here to feel. Before you go, tell me in the comments, out of these 5, which one do you know you're still holding? Not the easiest one to admit, the real one. Name it. One word, one number, whatever feels right. Because the act of naming it honestly, that's already the first step of releasing it. And if this video gave you something real today, subscribe. Hit the bell, share it with someone who's been doing all the spiritual work and still feels stuck. Sometimes the right words at the right moment are the thing that shifts everything. See you in the next one.